Capitalism is dead. Welcome to techno-feudalism, something far worse than capitalism. Once upon a time, even though capitalism infected everything, at least it left us a few hours a day when we were autonomous, when we could pretend to be liberal individuals. That is, the old-fashioned liberal idea that a man's home is his castle. There is a fence that ring fences the market, the bishop, the neighbor, even your own family, and allows you a space in which to be who you are, with your desires, your preferences, your tastes, your idiosyncrasies, your eccentricities. That ring fencing, that fence that allowed us to pretend or to imagine ourselves as liberal individuals has collapsed, has gone. Some years ago, I realized that when I saw the anxiety in the faces of students of mine, the anxiety was all about who their true self is. Now, once upon a time, that would have been an interesting discussion in the context of existentialist philosophy. What does it mean to be me? Who am I? This is not what's going on now. When you have Google, Facebook, and all these companies advocate amongst their employees and prospective employees, be yourself, be true to your own feelings and to your own emotions, which sounds very liberal, sounds fantastic. Youngsters who want a job there worry 24/7 on which self they must have. They know that when they post a video on TikTok, a message on Twitter, or X as it's called now, a photograph on Instagram, that will become part of the portfolio of their curated self, self-curated self, that an interviewer from big tech, from a bank, from somewhere will peruse, will investigate, will study before the interview or even during the interview that will determine their future career. Which means that at midnight, in their beds, doing things with a phone, they are no longer liberal individuals. They cannot even pretend to be liberal individuals. They are producers of the self that they think the cloudalists will want. To me, that is a science fiction dystopia, which has unfortunately turned into reality today. Whenever people talk to me about this book, about techno-feudalism, the first thing they identify with, or the first thing that they say which shows that they are concerned about techno-feudalism, is something that doesn't really bother me too much. They are worried about Big Brother, about surveillance, the fact that these machines and the people who own them know more about us than our friends, our family, even we ourselves know about ourselves. Now, that is a worry. I have no doubt that this is a worry for most people. But I'm worried about something far more threatening. Rather than losing sleep over what they know, I lose sleep about what they own. And they own my digital identity and, primarily, magnificent machines and software and artificial intelligence that has the capacity to modify my thinking and to modify my behavior so as to convince me to do things which are in the interests of those who own those machines. That's far scarier than simply Big Brother watching me. We've always been subject to propaganda. What techno-feudalism has done is to put us in very close contact with digital interfaces with which we interact in such a way as to train them, to train us, to train them, to train us, to train them, to infect our minds with desires which are functional to the interests of the cloudalists, of the owners of cloud capital. It's the very first time that we have this dialectical relationship with those who now own our minds or own a very substantial power over our minds. Cloud capital is based on algorithms. And algorithms are amazing at infecting our soul with desires that are based on a deep understanding of our past and capturing through this process our attention, which then it commodifies and sells to vassal capitalists who pay the algorithms owners a cloud rent for the privilege. Back in 1993, while I was connecting my dad to the fledgling internet then, using one of those terribly slow modems, he asked me the killer question: is this thing, this network, now that computers are speaking to one another, is the internet going to make capitalism invincible, or is it going to kill capitalism? Now the answer is in. The internet, once it was privatized in the context of cloud capital, of techno-feudalism, has killed capitalism. But it has done in a way which is consistent with the triumph of capital and our subjugation as proletarians, wage laborers, as middle-class people, even as vassal capitalists, to the power of those very, very few around the world, concentrated mainly in Silicon Valley, in the United States, and in Chinese big tech that own the instruments of techno-feudalism, that own cloud capital. People ask me, when was it that the internet was seriously privatized? The answer I give has to do with your identity. Once upon a time, you owned it. The state had an obligation to every citizen to provide you with a passport, a driver's license, an ID, paper ID or plastic ID, that identified you at no charge. You would walk into the polling station, a shop, an airport, and say, my name is XYZ, I own my identity, I can prove who I am. Do you realize you cannot do this online? You do not own your identity online. There's no way you can prove who you are. The only way of proving who you are is by begging some conglomerate to testify to who you are. So, for instance, if you want to identify yourself with Google, you have to use your credit card. In other words, Barclays Bank, Lloyds Bank, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, whatever, have to testify on your behalf who you are. Then you go into another website, you have to use your Google ID, which of course uses your bank's ID. So big tech and big finance own your identity. That is the beginning of techno-feudalism. Techno-feudalism is what happened once capitalism was upended, undermined, by the triumph of capital, this sweet, delicious irony. Capital, like a stupid virus, mutated into a hugely toxic form that killed off its host, capitalism. And something much, much worse has emerged from within capitalism. Under feudalism, all power, political, economic, cultural, emanated, sprang out of land. Those who owned land, the landed gentry, had it. And those who didn't have land were the peasants and the vassals that worked producing a rent, surplus, for those who owned the land. Capitalism emerged from the substitution of land with machinery, with steam engines, with steamships, telegraph poles, electricity grids, auto factories. Those who owned the machines, not those who owned the land, profited, which is not the same thing as rent. Entrepreneurial capitalist profit was the stream of wealth that built up more capital and created the modern world as we know it. Techno-feudalism has been supplanting capitalism over the last 10 years or so with a new form of capital, a mutant form of capital, which I call cloud capital. It's what lives on your mobile phone, on your laptop, all these applications. It's real capital. It doesn't live on the cloud. That's just a metaphor. It lives in optic fiber cables that are crisscrossing the world, on the ocean beds, cell phone towers, server farms, algorithms that workers actually produce, write, code. This new form of cloud capital has empowered its owners, people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, the owners of Google and so on, to modify our behavior. To modify our behavior in such a way that those owners of cloud capital, I call them cloudalists or techno-feudal lords, can extract wealth in the form of a new fungal type of rent, I call it cloud rent, both from workers, think of Amazon warehouse workers, who are moving around like robots with digital equipment on their wrists, telling them what to do, wired into this cloud capital. Cloud serfs like you and me, buying stuff from Amazon.com, posting reviews of books, of music on Spotify, on Netflix, and so on. We are producing capital for these big tech owners, the cloudalists, the owners of the cloud capital. We don't even know we're doing it. We think we are having fun. We may be having fun, but it is work that we do, which is not paid for, as cloud serfs. So we have the cloud proles in the warehouses and the factories. We have cloud serfs all over the world, and we have capitalists who are vassals now to these big tech owners, to the cloudalists. Why are they vassals? Because every time you buy something from Amazon.com, from Alibaba, whatever, even Deliveroo, you are allowing the owner of the cloud capital to charge 40% when you buy a book, a bicycle, a meal. 40% of what you pay goes not to the producer, to the capitalist, and to the workers that the capitalist exploits, but to the owner of cloud capital. That's a form of cloud rent. So just like in feudalism, you had land and rent. Now you have a digital kind of land, which is of course the cloud, built by huge amounts of cloud capital, and cloud rent, which leads to the accumulation of rents in the hands of this new ruling class, whom I call cloudalists. You may call them techno-feudal lords or whatever. The moment you enter Amazon.com, you exit the market. You exit capitalism. You enter a cloud fiefdom belonging to one man and his algorithm, who matches you with vassal capitalists, whom it charges 40% of what you pay them. You cannot talk to anybody, not other buyers, not sellers. It's not a marketplace. It is really a trading fiefdom owned by Jeff Bezos. And you do this only so as to enrich with new cloud rents the cloudalist, the techno-feudal lord that owns it. One of the first success stories of cloud capital, of techno-feudalism's triumphant march, was Apple under Steve Jobs. Apple is a company which is worth around $3 trillion. Now, why is that? The iPhone was a major breakthrough for techno-feudalism, not because it was such a great phone, even though Steve Jobs was very clever in the way he packaged all sorts of technologies that were produced, by the way, by some government grant, whether it was the touch screen, Wi-Fi, and so on. Everything in the iPhone was produced by state research. Let's not forget that. But setting that aside, what gave the iPhone the tremendous capacity to accumulate wealth on behalf of Steve Jobs and Apple was the genius thought by Steve Jobs to create the Apple Store. The Apple Store is the source of strength of the iPhone. Why? Because when Apple designed the iPhone, they created 3 or 4 apps of their own. But this is where Steve Jobs' genius comes in. He had the idea of opening the Apple Store to third-party developers, effectively saying to coders around the world, small companies, large companies, build your own app, and you will sell it through my iPhone, through the App Store, which one can only access exclusively through the iPhone, not through a Samsung phone, a Sony phone, an Ericsson phone, a Nokia phone. So suddenly you had thousands of very smart app developers, people coming up with ideas of introducing a digital version of a compass, of games, of all sorts of things that you can find in the App Store. These people worked, from Apple's perspective, for free to develop this plethora of apps, of tools that you can use if you have an iPhone, and you can only use if you have an iPhone. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs and Apple charged 40%, 35 to 40% of every dollar or pound that you paid the third-party developer for access to the Apple Store, both for you and for that developer. Essentially, that was the first fully-fledged cloud fiefdom. The capitalist, small scale, medium scale, large scale, who produces the app, could be a bank, Could be the Bank of America. It produces an app, it sells it through the App Store. So Steve Jobs and Apple charge them a considerable amount of money for this access. You pay it, Apple pays absolutely nothing and collects a cloud rent. That was the beginning. Then it was replicated by Google in its Play Store and every other cloud list, every other example of cloud capital at work. When Elon Musk purchased Twitter, it was generally thought of as another tantrum by a spoiled brat with too much money in his bank account. Whatever you may think about Elon Musk, there was rationality and there was purpose in the madness. Elon Musk's many companies, very successful companies, lacked one thing, an interface with cloud capital. Twitter was exactly that. He bought Twitter in order to turn his Tesla cars that move around, driven by people who paid quite a bit of money for those cars, creating huge data sets about what music they are listening to while they are driving, where they are going, and so on. He had this cloud capital, but he needed an interface with you. And Twitter was his everything app. It is intended to turn his existing empire into an undefeated and invincible empire that also has payment systems in it. Twitter was never going to be a public square for us to have a conversation. Elon Musk is very smart, too smart not to know that. History has a habit of riding on the coattails of unintended consequences. And the history of techno-feudalism has ridden in on the coattails of the great financial collapse and the manner in which the great and the good, the powers that be, dealt with that crisis or tried to deal with that crisis, what I call a combination of socialism for the bankers and austerity for everybody else. Cloud capital grew very fast, exponentially, after 2009. It could have grown anyway, but it was the financial calamity known as GFC, the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, that was a major boost for cloud capital. Now, there's no conspiracy here, none whatsoever. What happened was all banks in the United States, in Britain, in the European Union, every single one of them went bankrupt. Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, in April 2009, gathered in London the G7's prime ministers, presidents, and central bankers, and they decided to save the bankers. So they printed between April 2009 and today around 35 trillion US dollars, with which they replenished the destroyed financial capital that the stupid and toxic bankers had fretted away, had destroyed. Now that money had to be lent to someone, because this is what bankers do. The worst nightmare of a bank is to have money that he doesn't lend on. The problem was that at the very same time as they were printing $35 trillion in order to salvage the banks, they were imposing harsh austerity on the people of Britain, on the people of Greece, of Germany, of France, of Portugal, of Italy, of Ireland, and of course of the United States of America, despite the rumors to the contrary by Barack Obama that he was introducing a stimulus. There was no such stimulus if you look at the austerity at the level of the states, not the federal government. So there was austerity everywhere and socialism for the bankers. So huge amounts of money in the financial circuits, no money in the economy. So no intelligent, old-fashioned capitalist producing cars, electronic equipment, whatever, would ever invest, because they looked at the little people were impecunious, they didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, so why produce good stuff, expensive stuff for them? Austerity had destroyed investment. So what the capitalists did was they took the loans from the banks and they went back to the stock exchange to purchase their own shares, because that way their share price went up, even though they were not producing much. They were not selling anything, they didn't have profits. But they bought their own shares with the money that the central banks printed. Their bonuses were linked to their share price. They were laughing all the way to the proverbial bank, back to their mansion, buying their yachts, art, Bitcoin. That's why you had the rally of everything, while austerity was destroying both investment in things society needs and the life prospects of people around the world who only had bullshit jobs, to use David Graeber's term, to contend with. The only capitalists that took the money from the financial sector that the central banks had printed to actually invest in real capital were the Jeff Bezoses and the Googles and the Apples of the world. And they used this money to invest in cloud capital. So cloud capital that would have grown anyway grew 100 times faster as a result of the great financial crisis and the way in which our governments responded to it. Remember, I said there's no conspiracy here. Actually, there are no conspirators. But it is as if there is a conspiracy, a completely sort of surreptitious one that nobody realized and nobody implemented in order to build up cloud capital. As a socialist economist, I've always been accused of proposing that we pluck an imaginary money tree. Remember Thatcher saying that the problem with socialists is that at some point they run out of other people's money. Well, they have been using other people's money. They've been using the money tree. They've plucked the money tree to the tune of tens of trillions of dollars. They don't have a problem with the money tree. They've invented the money tree. They love the money tree. They make a lot of money out of the money tree. What they don't want is for you to have access to the money tree. When people talk about capitalism, it's important that they should define what they mean by it. Because it's not about markets. It is not about capital being present and substantial. Capital was always around. Even under feudalism there was capital. Even in ancient Rome and in ancient Athens we had capital. So what is capitalism? Capitalism is a system that has two pillars that are doing most of the work of propping up the socioeconomic system that we have. One is markets. Under feudalism there was labor, but there was no labor market. People worked, they didn't get a wage, they couldn't quit. There were no classifieds for people to look for another job. You know, they worked on the estate where they were born. And that was it. And then at the end of the day, at the end of the harvest, the feudal lord would collect a part of their harvest that would be the rent. End of story. Labor, no labor market. Land, no market for land, no real estate market. Either you inherited the land, or you were given land by royal decree, or you won land in some kind of war of conquest, civil war, foreign war, whatever, or you didn't have land. You were a landless peasant. Capitalism commodified labor and land. It is interesting how it did it. Initially, in England, in Wales, and primarily in Scotland, in the Highlands, the enclosures. The peasants were chucked out of the land, they were evicted, replaced by sheep because of the price of wool. By evicting the peasants, by building enclosures, fences, they created a proletariat, that is, people who had nothing and who would knock on doors and say, I will do anything for a loaf of bread. That's the first labor market. Selling your labor services or labor time to somebody for a loaf of bread, pounds, yen, dollars, it doesn't matter. Meanwhile, the sheep that replaced the peasants on the land, now that they enclosed land, because we knew, or they knew, how much wool they could produce, they knew the international price of wool, they knew how much every acre was worth in terms of its capacity to produce wealth, surplus value. So you have the commodification of land and the commodification of labor. So capitalism is markets. Suddenly, things that were happening, economic activity, work, distribution, and so on, that was outside markets is done inside markets. That's why the market is such a big thing for both defenders of capitalism and opponents of capitalism. And inside the marketplace, surplus value produced by those who work and which is extracted by those who own the means of production turns into profit. So profit, markets, the two pillars of capitalism. That's what capitalism is. It's not just markets. Profits and markets and the commodification of labor and of everything. What's techno-feudalism? Techno-feudalism is what happened once cloud capital created new digital landscapes, digital fiefdoms, as I call them, which allowed the owners of these digital fiefdoms, the owners of big tech and so on, to collect cloud rents, the 40% of the value of anything you buy from Amazon.com and so on and so forth. So what has replaced markets? These digital platforms, which are not markets. The moment you enter Amazon.com, you think you're in a market, you're not in a market, you are in a digital fiefdom belonging to Jeff Bezos. And what has replaced profits? Cloud rent. One of the hardest distinctions I have ever had to make as a lecturer of economics back in the day was between profit and rent. Students find it very difficult to understand because technically, arithmetically, they're no different. It's what you are left with if you own something, if you're selling something, if you're an entrepreneur, an owner, after you subtract costs. You subtract costs from revenues, you end up with profit or rent. So what's the difference between profit and rent? Well, the difference is that profit results from entrepreneurial activity, whereas rent results from ownership. Just the accident of history where you inherit a piece of land or a building, or you are sitting on a spot where there's a lot of oil underneath. To make it even more vivid, take a building in Fulham or in Islington. Let's say you own the building. Now, suppose that in that building there is a cafeteria, a coffee shop. And suppose you are now the owner of the coffee shop, of the brand of coffee shop, Fulham Coffee, whatever, or Islington Coffee. Now, if lots of other coffee shops open up in the area and the area becomes even trendier than it is, that's bad for you because you have more competition. So your profits shrink. Competition is bad for your profits as a capitalist, as an entrepreneur. But if you own the building, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to invest. You don't need to make the place look better. You just fall asleep. You go to the Bahamas. You go to Sydney and you surf on Bondi Beach, and you get richer simply because of competition. Because the more competition there is, the higher the asset price, the price of your building, the rents you can charge. That is a fundamental difference. So capitalism has been celebrated by free marketeers, by Adam Smith, Hayek, libertarians, Thatcher, and so on, because it is a reward for entrepreneurial contribution to society, the opposite of the reward to nothing of the rentiers. And indeed, people like Winston Churchill and other liberals, conservatives, celebrated the capitalist and dumped on the rentier. What we now have is the revenge of rent. It takes a new form. It's no longer ground rent. You don't get rent from the building. Of course, there is still ground rent, and a lot of people, especially in London, make a lot of money, or in New York, from the fact that rents have gone through the roof. But now the big money, the huge quantities of wealth, come in the form of cloud rent. This is what Google, Microsoft, Spotify, Uber, Airbnb charge. They charge for access to their cloud land, to the cloud real estate, to their cloud capital. And they charge many, many billions, if not trillions. That's the foundation of techno-feudalism. Back in the 1770s, there were some important thinkers. One of them was Adam Smith, the patron saint of free marketeers, who detected that something was going on in the foundations of feudalism that was going to upend feudalism, overthrow it, and replace it with a new system, capitalism. Those great thinkers, including David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and John Stuart Mill, now they could have called the new system industrial feudalism. They didn't. They ditched the word feudalism and they called it capitalism in order to allow us, or their generation, to focus their mind on the great transformation that was going on. It wasn't just that feudalism was changing its clothes and metamorphosizing. It was being upended. It was being transformed into something very different. Today, we could equally call techno-feudalism rentier capitalism, digital platform capitalism, capitalism on steroids, hyper-capitalism, algorithmic capitalism, and all that would be fine, proper, and scientifically not inaccurate. But it would fail to concentrate our minds on the fact that capitalism has transformed into a completely different species. In the same way that biologists, when they look at the evolution of viruses like COVID-19, they look at variant A and B and C and C1 and C2. At some point, when the virus mutates too much and it actually creates a new species of virus, they change the name. That's why I believe now we need to call the system, the exploitative, awful system we live in, no longer some variety of capitalism, but techno-feudalism. One of the side effects of techno-feudalism is that it rendered the liberal individual obsolete. The other is that it destroyed any prospect of social democracy. Social democracy was an attempt to create some kind of social contract, grand bargain between organized capital, industrial capital, and organized labor. Organized labor has been fading now since Thatcher and Reagan. But what has happened in the meantime is that industrial capital has become absolutely irrelevant from the moment that it became a vassal to cloud capital. How do you sit around the table down Jeff Bezos on the one hand and all the cloud serfs who are contributing to the cloud rents of Amazon.com and the cloud pros working in the Amazon warehouses and the trucks and so on that distribute the goods that vassal capitalists sell through Amazon.com to cloud serfs? It simply is not possible. The relationship between democracy and capitalism is a source of enormous confusion. We tend to think that capitalism and democracy are somehow colleagues, partners. The opposite is true. Lest we forget, capitalism emerged in Britain in the 19th century in the absence of democracy. We must never confuse liberalism with democracy. Liberalism is about the rights of property owners. Democracy is about a system of government where the poor rule courtesy of being the majority. The very term liberal democracy is an absurdity, it's a contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing as liberal democracy, and there never has been. What we have, and we think of as liberal democracy, is an autocracy of capital, always have had, where regular elections legitimize the absence of democracy and the complete domination and hegemony of capital. Once capital mutated into cloud capital, this illusion of liberal democracy has begun to fragment, and instead we have what everybody recognizes as a system of perfect surveillance that makes Big Brother feel ashamed of himself, or makes the KGB feel that they wasted all their efforts, because now we have voluntary servitude, voluntary transfer of our data to Big Brother, who is not the state, who is not some monster. They're simply the new ruling class, controlling and owning the means of computation, the means of behavioral modification, which I call cloud capital. Cloud capital's greatest trick is to give us a sense of being in control of our applications, of loving what we do. And this is a confession. I can't live without, well, I suppose I could live without cloud capital. I don't want to live without cloud capital. I need my apps. I have an idea. I'm enraged by some injustice somewhere in the world. I need to go to Twitter, or X, whatever they call it now, and post it. I watch Netflix. I listen to Spotify, and I appreciate Spotify's recommendations to me. So in the same way that Marxists have always said in the past that the worst servitude, the worst slavery is the one that we volunteer for. Cloud capital is the apotheosis of that voluntary servitude because it gives us tools that we should have, that we deserve to have. The question is not whether we should be using those tools. The question is who owns them and what is the effect of these property rights to the very, very few, or for the very, very few, the cloudalists. What is the effect of this unequal distribution of cloud capital for society, for nature, for the climate catastrophe, for the way in which we organize our daily lives individually and collectively? One of the greatest threats to humanity is the tensions between the United States and China, the new Cold War. Why is it happening? It's not happening because of Taiwan, and it's not happening because the Chinese are ruled by a Communist Party. That was the case 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when the United States was struggling to induct the Chinese Communist Party in China into the World Trade Organization, into globalized capitalism, into its own realm. So what has changed? What has changed is techno-feudalism, the rise of cloud capital. There are only two sites on Earth where cloud capitalism has grown in the way that capital, terrestrial capital, had grown during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Silicon Valley, the United States of America, and China. These are the two huge, gigantic cloud fiefdoms. And the new Cold War can only be understood as a clash of two cloud fiefdoms, of two techno-feudalisms. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the rise of this tension between the two cloud fiefdoms of the United States and the Chinese one, in the same way that the great financial crisis accelerated the rise of cloud capital. Before Putin ordered his troops into Ukraine, Chinese big tech on the one hand and the Chinese central bank on the other were creating remarkable digital payment systems. Digital payment systems far more advanced than what the West has. Not because the West is backward, not because the United States is backward, but because in the United States, Google on the one hand and Apple, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street on the other were never seeing eye to eye. Wall Street never wanted to forfeit its monopoly over the dollarized payment system to big tech. That's why there was never an app in the United States that was as sophisticated as WeChat, the Tencent app in China, which allows you to do everything that Netflix, Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, and so on allow you to do, plus everything that a free banking app can do. That doesn't exist in the United States because Wall Street won't allow it. The Chinese have developed that together with the Chinese central bank's digital currency, Digital Yuan, which is remarkable in the sense that you get a free bank account with the central bank directly, which means you have perfect safety. You don't have to worry about the bankruptcy of some private bank. And you can make free payments around the world, of course, in the Chinese currency. That was like a super highway. Imagine building a 6-lane super highway that nobody's using. Because before the war in Ukraine, it was not being used much. And it wasn't being used much because the Chinese capitalists were using the dollarized payment system. That's where they made their money, in the United States. But the moment, immediately after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 by Vladimir Putin, the United States authorities ordered also the Europeans to follow, confiscated between $350 and $400 billion of monies belonging to the Russian central bank. I'm not going to pass judgment on that at all. I'm simply stating it. Now, not just Russians, but Indonesian, Malaysian, Saudi Arabian, United Arab Emirates billionaires who had all their money in the dollarized payment system suddenly lost their sleep because they thought, well, if they do it to the Russians, they may do it to us tomorrow. The Americans, that is. So suddenly, they had an incentive to start utilizing the Chinese digital payments superhighway. So a lot of those monies started being channeled through that superhighway. Do you want to know why the BRICS suddenly are being courted by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates? The BRICS, by the way, is just C. It's only China. That's the only power within the BRICS that's worth discussing. So, to understand all these developments at the geopolitical level, Ukraine, the new Cold War between the United States and China, BRICS, why is Saudi Arabia, which is a traditional ally of Washington, D.C., why are they courting, along with the United Arab Emirates, China? You need to see it in terms of this clash of the two techno-feudal systems of the new cloud fiefdoms. Of course, in this context, Europe is a gross irrelevance. And Britain, once it fell out of Europe, is even a greater irrelevance. The Global South has turned away from Europe. They do not consider Europe to be an interesting place at all. They may have a lot of affinity with European culture, philosophy, political traditions. They may feel much closer to Paris, to Vienna, to Berlin as a cultural and political center than they feel towards Washington, D.C. or Beijing. But the Global South knows that there is a mighty clash between two cloud fiefs, the American and the Chinese. And this is the main game. How do they position themselves? Take a country like Mexico. It is absolutely locked into the United States cloud fief due to the former NAFTA, to the free trade agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. But at the same time, it is looking into China and to the Chinese cloud fief, as well as big finance in Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, as a means of extricating itself from the yoke of the American imperialist power over them. That's the Global South situation today, and I very much fear that Europe is not part of it. Meanwhile, while techno-feudalism is dividing into two conflicting cloud fiefs, we, humanity, our species, is proving on a daily basis that we are stupid astronauts in a spaceship that we are poisoning the air of. We had COP27, now have COP28. We are absolutely failing the test of arresting the climate crisis. They're arresting the process by which we poison the air we breathe. The clock is counting down our demise, our extinction, and we are really doing absolutely nothing about it as a species facing oblivion. We humans have a tremendous knack at turning wonderful creations, fantastic artifacts of our own making, into the worst possible nightmares. We've been doing this since we developed iron technologies, the age of iron. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is another example. Today, we have these artificial intelligence algorithms which, while producing remarkable antibiotics that no human brain could have designed in good time to defeat superbugs that are killing children and adults in hospitals today. Triumph of the human spirit. We have turned a triumph through cloud capital, through empowering the cloudalists to own these algorithms into effectively the usurpers of our own minds. Techno-feudalism is not a theoretical exercise for an author and for readers of that book. It's a clear and present danger, because the more cloud rent people like Jeff Bezos amass, the more unstable our economies. The less money there is around to purchase the things that those wonderful machines can create, the deeper the economic crisis will be, the more the central banks will need to print money in order to keep the show on the road, the more there will be toxic politicians who would try to make sure that the little people do not get access to that money so as to maintain the monopoly of the very few, the more nasty, brutish, and short life is going to be in societies that simply can no longer afford a welfare state, public education, and national health service. The greater the pace at which climate catastrophe hits us, especially developing countries, and the sooner we are going to end up beyond the point of no return. Hitler's greatest power was a man called Goebbels and his remarkable command over the media. His theory of propaganda, which is you secure complete monopoly of the media. You tell a large lie repeatedly through that media, and you make this lie up. You construct it out of fragments of small truths that comprise the big lie. That today is being automated. It is processed through amazing machinery, networked machinery, with algorithms using reinforcement mechanisms by which to learn from us what all these fragments of truth are that will compose the big lie. If there is one enemy that we must defeat in order to begin the process of emancipation, That is the monopoly of the media, owned by the cloudalists, owned by those whose purpose it is to make sure that you do not control your mind anymore. One of the hardest things is to even begin to conceptualize of capitalism, not just its demise, but what it is. Because we are like fish in a fish tank vis-a-vis water. We take it for granted. We don't even see it. It's something we swim in. But capitalism is not a natural system of organizing our activities. This is why, without us even noticing, it has developed into something even worse, which I call techno-feudalism, which again has the capacity through the digital spaces and this vista of applications that become part and parcel of our world, an extension of our fingers, of our eyes, of our senses. It's so easy not to notice that this is a creation of human beings that could be otherwise. Everything could be different. When we look around us, we see no empirical evidence that good things are coming. But this is neither here nor there. This is not a game of predicting the weather. The weather doesn't give a damn about us, and therefore we're at liberty to prognosticate it. Feudalism did not end because the feudal lords were persuaded that there is a better system. Feudalism ended because of a vast alliance of peasants, workers, and merchants, proto-capitalists. Similarly, the techno-feudalism which is destroying our prospects is not going to end because Elon Musk is going to change his mind, because Jeff Bezos is going to be persuaded that there is a better way of doing things. It will end if there is a grand alliance between cloud proletarians, between cloud serfs like us, even some vassal capitalists who have to pay 40% of the asking price to the cloudalists. That grand alliance is the only chance humanity has of emancipation. If social democracy, liberal democracy, even capitalism are bunk, what is the alternative to techno-feudalism? It can only be techno-democracy. We cannot disinvent cloud capital, nor should we want to, because cloud capital, these technologies, can liberate humanity as long as we socialize them, as long as we take control, property rights over them, and distribute them to those who produce them. Because it's you and I, everyone, who is producing cloud capital with our posts, our videos, our coding, our public education, which contributes to the collective knowledge which is necessary to write artificial intelligence programs. Now, it's a big ask. Some may say that it is utopian to think that we can create a society where these applications, these algorithms, this artificial intelligence is commonly owned. It's turned into a commons. It may sound utopian, but it is far less utopian than to think that we can regulate them by using a nation state which is no longer fit for purpose. This is why it is essential to be political, because the solution is not going to be technical. It's not going to be managerial. The solution requires an international progressive movement that takes control of the machines, of the algorithms, of the artificial intelligence, and puts it hard at work on behalf of humanity. Technology has always exhilarated us as humans, and it has always frightened us. From the days of Pandora, from the days of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That fear and exhilaration at the present juncture reminds us that as a species, we are facing a fork on the road on which we're traveling. One direction takes us to the dystopia of the Matrix, where we become the feeders of the technologies that we've created. We become the servants, the slaves of our own artifacts. The other, and this is a silver lining, is the road that takes us to a world closer to Star Trek, where the machines are our servants and where the common ownership of the machines allows us to sit around, discuss philosophy, and travel the universe in search of alien civilizations. In this struggle for humanity's future, the independent media are an essential ally. The mainstream media are part of the cloud capital that is usurping your mind, my mind, our mind. This is why we need independent news outlets. For the future of journalism, for the future of the news, please join DoubleDownNews on Patreon.